I was just in Steven's film, and before that, I saw How to Survive a Plague. Did people see that? Has anyone seen that one? How to Survive a Plague, about ACT UP. But there was a line in both films, which was "The whole world is watching" in both films, and ACT UP was from the '80s. And yours was like a reference to probably, I don't know if that was a reference to this 1968 Chicago confrontation with police, but this kind of theme that the world is watching, and the people you guys are filming, and you as filmmakers are also transcending these borders. I'm wondering if you guys could start out by talking a little bit about what kind of firewall you had to face in order to get your films out to the public. Maybe you can start.
What do you mean by firewall, actually?
Okay, sorry. Well, right. So Steven's film is about, they call themselves citizen reporters. They're kind of careful to say we're not journalists, because journalist is kind of a bad word for them. So they faced a lot of challenges in doing their reporting and getting it to the domestic audience. But you also faced, I think, probably kind of a firewall of your own in getting this material out, shooting it and getting it to us. I think it's interesting to think about you guys all as kind of citizen reporters. And some of them, we could kind of get into this. What do you consider yourself? Are you a journalist or filmmaker or citizen reporter? But I imagine there were challenges for yourself in making the film.
Actually, I guess when I started the project, I was really concerned about that, like what the risks were for the subjects, for myself. It was really surprising to me that it turned out that I wasn't taking nearly even remotely the same risk as the subjects were. A lot of people have video cameras in China, and one co-producer told me, he's like, in actuality, don't worry, because documentary doesn't really have much of a presence or impact in China. Nobody's going to watch your movie on the scale that they would, the authorities would be concerned about.
So you really felt it was just it was pretty straightforward and easy. You were never under any duress or fear.
There were definitely moments where we would travel around, and the period leading up to the Olympics was tense, and we would be in a hostel, and Zola and I would be wondering who the only guy without a backpack, dressed in business casual, sitting reading the newspaper was in the lobby, and was there like 3 days in a row, but without incident. So it was always mysterious when things like that happened.
So I guess as an American, you have a lot of privileges that your subjects don't have.
Yeah, and I think as a filmmaker, you quickly inherit this like burden of responsibility to assess what your impact is going to be, and to really state very clearly to your subjects the degree to which you'll be documenting them, and what you intend to do with that, and what your intentions are. And I think you quickly find yourself doing a lot of soul searching, because what you set out, what I set out, what I thought my interest was in the story was not at all what we wound up making.
Well, Karim, did you feel, you were in this, it was like Cairo was on fire. Journalists were also under great threat. What about those, was it 12 days, 12 days when you were filming? Did you feel under any threat?
Well, yeah, I mean, we were all, is this on? I can't tell. Yeah, okay. I mean, at first we didn't really know what kind of danger we were in, really. I think you kind of get caught up in the adrenaline of the movement, and you see hundreds of thousands of people in the street, and you know, those first days I actually felt quite safe on the street, and safer on the street than at home, because at home really you kind of become your own worst enemy, and you start imagining, you know, what's happening, and the paranoia sets in, and every day is sort of becomes increasingly dangerous, but for different reasons, you know. And I mean, I was shot at, I was filmed, you know, a lot of people filming me, making sure they get my face, and that's partly why we have these, we're kind of wearing masks in most of the film when we're filming in the street. But as it kind of progressed, I mean, we felt that xenophobia come around, sort of get more intense, and also, you know, there was a lot of rumors that this whole thing was orchestrated by foreigners, and there was an agenda that was either being paid for by Israel or by America, and that the protesters were being paid to be there, and which were total lies. But you know, it sort of, these are all kind of the dirty tricks that the regime uses to divide the people, you know. But we did hear of like friends of ours and people that we kind of friends of friends that were journalists, you know, getting their hard drives confiscated and their cameras broken, and followed home and arrested and beaten up, and so there was a lot of danger at a certain point. We just couldn't go out in the street anymore with the cameras. It was sort of diminishing returns anyway, really, you know, for the risk factor. So a lot of that time we were kind of stuck at home, and in a way it was totally interesting because of that anxiety and because of that paranoia of the characters stuck at home. It made for very compelling filmmaking, even though we couldn't go down in the street. So you know, things move and shift in our film, and it's sort of like kind of an anthropological study of what happens to people in a revolution. You know, what happens to the group dynamic, what happens to kind of the emotional ranges that are occurring, and witnessing that, and we're showing you kind of in the film as well. You can, if you watch our film, you'll start to study behaviors, you know, and that was really interesting because I was more interested in really the human story rather than the revolution, telling the story of the revolution. I was focusing on telling the human story of people reacting to the revolution. Right. So,
and Allison, Ai Weiwei is enormously brave, and you see in your film him go through all types of kind of ups and downs of his ability to express himself. Did you feel anything on your end as you know, the documenter of Ai Weiwei, that you were under any restriction or concern?
Well, so let's see. I mean, so I felt like when I was with Ai Weiwei, I was there in my capacity as a documentary filmmaker, but I also was an accredited journalist in China. So there, you know, I felt like, I always kind of felt like I was both. And what you really had to think about in each instance is, you know, when is it important to, you know, it's kind of like assessing not really which role you're in, but like which role you should be revealing or concealing. And as Stephen said, 100%, since I'm not a Chinese citizen, I definitely felt like the risks were much higher for the people that I was documenting. And so my number one concern was always, is my presence ever going to make the situation worse for them? Because that's like the first priority. And then I would say pretty much the second priority was to keep my footage and to not have the camera broken. There are definitely times, and I watched the movie just now, it was just playing at Jesse, and I was sitting with the audience, and it was the first time I watched it this festival. And I was just remembering, you know, one of my favorite scenes is when the police are filming them having dinner, and Weiwei's own videographer comes and films, you know, right up on his LCD screen, and then they have this kind of face-off, you know. And I was thinking about how it felt at that dinner because, you know, there's so many cameras that you see in that scene, and then the other camera is mine, you know, I mean, that's capturing all the other cameras, and thinking about how awesome the footage, like, I thought it was so funny when it was happening. but I'm filming the guy filming me, you know? And the same thing where it's like, you have that flash where I'm like, should I be trying to obscure my face? That's ridiculous. He's like gonna have my face. Like they're gonna have I've checked into a hotel here and they registered my passport. I mean, they know that I'm here. But I kind of feel like my feeling was, you know, but what's really going to be the result of that guy getting me on a camera? Who's going to watch that? Do they really connect with people in Beijing who, you know, monitor me for my work? And I guess I kind of felt like you see sort of the absurdity in some of those scenes and the way that people sort of exercise their authority. And I guess sometimes I would just, whether it was a coping mechanism or if it was actually being pretty realistic and saying like, you know, yeah, they have me on camera and they have Weiwei's door has cameras on it since 2009. And, you know, again, some days if I felt funny, I would like not look at the camera, and some days I'd like wave at the camera. I don't know who's watching it, you know? So I think it really is being in enough. It's not to say then you should be cavalier about it, but I think if you really are deeply within a situation and an environment and you're aware enough to make those kind of decisions. And so the worst would be to go in and be completely afraid or completely blasé about it, and you really have to be concerned about all the people who you are affecting by your presence. But I think that in a lot of these, certainly in China, there's a line and it moves all the time, and you're just like, if you're smart about it, like Ai Weiwei, people are kind of making those considerations all the time.
So a big central theme here is control and circumvention, basically. And that was your phrase last night at Bar Berlin when we started talking about what we were going to do on this panel. You know, basically we're looking at this condition of people being able to express themselves either, you know, creatively, but also, you know, about things of substance, of great importance. In your film, there's environmental problems, murders, things that journalists, you know, quote official journalists are having trouble reporting on. Something I'd love to hear about is what you think in your particular situations the benefits of being called a journalist are, and also the liabilities. And there's a great range here, I think. And Josh, maybe we can start with you, because you made news, was it February 1st?
Yeah.
And this was a central issue. Is Josh a journalist or not, and what protections does he have under the First Amendment?
Well, for those of you who don't know, I'm on this panel not because it just came out with the film, but because there was a very interesting film taken of me being arrested at the House of Representatives that ended up, you know, I don't know, it was on television quite a lot. It was on YouTube. It was, we actually knocked Mitt Romney off the top of Huffington Post. It was kind of an extremely surreal day. I had gone to tape a public hearing in the House of Representatives, and they have a policy that you have to be accredited as a journalist. That's not a quality distinction. It's simply about there are certain reporters that live on the Hill, and they're there all day, and they tape all the hearings, and they're the Hill crew. And as documentary filmmakers, we have gone to the Congress and the Senate and asked them before to tape hearings. And they always say, okay, that's fine. It's at the discretion, or so-called, of the chair of that committee. And when the Democrats were in charge of the House, we had no problems. But since the Republicans took over, we were getting increasingly more and more flack. No, you can't tape this hearing. In fact, we had hired accredited crews in the past to tape hearings, when in fact the film came up during some of these hearings, and I'm sitting there on my hands. I can't tell anybody that I'm in there because I'm not visible as a present person. So finally, they're blocking us from an extremely important hearing for our film and for our story.
This is for the
sequel to Gasland.
Right.
Following these incredible cowboys out in Pavilion, Wyoming, who've gotten the EPA to come in and test their water and found 50 times the level of benzene in the groundwater. And the Republicans are using this hearing, very, very clearly using this hearing to attack the EPA and to attack science. It's a science and committee hearing, and they're there to attack science. So we wanted in, and I had called the night before Amy Goodman and Bill Moyers. Both of them said this is a bad rule. You have to just be allowed in. There was this idea that documentarians are not accredited journalists. But the First Amendment states, Congress shall make no law which infringes upon the freedom of the press. we've had a really bad year for the First Amendment. First Amendment also talks about freedom of assembly, right? So when you're seeing mass arrests of people and people getting pepper sprayed and police brutality, you know that we're in a deep, deep problem right now in the United States of America. When you think about who's a journalist, those people being pepper sprayed, that was taken by not journalists, right? That's the citizen media. But when I got out of jail, and so long story short is we decided to challenge that rule, and they arrested me on the floor of the House. And the video that was up on YouTube and on MSNBC and wherever else it was actually taken by congressional staff. I was rolling my camera, and they kept getting in our face. They said, "Well, you turn off the camera." I said, "No, I will not turn off the camera. This is the First Amendment." And so they arrested me, and as it turned out, the cop who was taking me out got this amazing Steadicam shot right over my shoulder. Did a brilliant job of shooting the whole thing as he led my camera out while it was rolling. But the point is that Brad Miller, congressman, after the ranking member of the Democratic said, you know, if the First Amendment states, if you wake up in the morning and declare yourself a journalist, you're a journalist. That's the way it works. But that's the way the First Amendment works. And I think it's this notion of accreditation is one more of these loopholes. And if you're allowed in the United States to use that as a means of taking people out of a hearing, as long as they're not disruptive, you know, and you're sitting there, you should be able to go ahead and tape what you need to tape. And what we're seeing here, because I think we all talk about how much documentary film there is now because we all have cameras and it's accessible. But what we actually have now is free speech, as opposed to before, mediated free speech. Whereas there was a certain number of networks in control of what people saw. Now you have a whole different thing erupting, and you're seeing as a reaction to it in the United States, in China, and increasingly secretive ways of government, increasingly secretive ways of repressing what you're doing. Because if I'd bowed out and said, no, we're not coming, okay, they won't have us, then I would have surrendered my First Amendment rights.
Well, there is a distinction between freedom of speech and freedom of press. And I find this kind of interesting because some documentary filmmakers say, I'm a storyteller, I'm an artist, you know, I have First Amendment protection as an artist. Artists have First Amendment protections. Ai Weiwei here would have had total First Amendment protections. He probably would not call himself a journalist. By calling yourself a journalist, get extra protection.
In fact, I never called myself a journalist. I was amazed when I walked out and the headline was "Journalist Arrested on the Floor of the House." I was like, "Oh wow, that's an amazing new title to have." Yeah. And I think the people, the Huffington Post, did that intentionally but that's the truth. Right. The truth is, if you're there to report, it's a very interesting distinction. Who's a member of the press now? Because obviously, we're seeing the best reporting come from on the ground, come from people who were just there when something happened. I mean, how many tweets and things from Arab Spring did we actually see, realize what was happening because of that?
I think that gets us to this key issue of, Stephen, in your film, and I think in your film too, the amount of, you know, citizen reporting, citizen media. These are non-professional journalists, and by not being a journalist, they actually had advantages. You would get advantages as a credentialed journalist. In your situations, it was the non-credentialed journalists who had certain advantages for reporting the truth.
Yeah, actually, I think if I was an accredited journalist, I probably would have been, you know, targeted and probably beaten up much easier. I mean, they knew where they were, and those guys, they got their heads cracked open, you know, and their stuff was smashed, and things that happened to like Anderson Cooper and his cameraman. I mean, I never seen a guy get, you know, his face was just completely purple and swollen and really got beaten bad, really bad. And it's because they were registered journalists, you know. We actually, when we got arrested, the night we got arrested, we had cameras on us. They didn't frisk us. They didn't notice that we had the cameras. And Omar actually had a press card, a Danish press card. I said, don't use that. Don't use that. Unless they find the camera, don't say, just tell them you're a tourist. You know, that's what we did. I mean, we simply just lied our way through and became, you know, tried to stay as anonymous as possible. And I think that was the only way to really get the story, is just try to be as invisible as possible and avoid detection. You know, as soon as you're on the radar, people follow you, and it's much harder to kind of get things done. That's why a lot of these shots that everyone experienced on TV were made from, 5-star luxury hotels with a very long zoom lens off the balcony. And these were the only things that kind of that we could see on the news, because it was simply too dangerous for those accredited journalists to be in the street. So we had the advantage of really just being anonymous and being able to kind of, and also it's my neighborhood, so I know a lot of the people, and I can hide quickly. I know my way around town, and so that really allowed us to get these things done.
Stephen, do you want to talk about why your subjects say we are not journalists?
It's much the same reason, like Tiger Temple in particular says that very line, why would I bother calling myself a journalist? I mean, or a citizen journalist even though he knows very well it's something he partakes in. It's, that would soon enough, if everybody started doing that, lead to certain laws being passed that put certain restrictions on that kind of activity, and put it into sort of that hierarchy of the spectrum of newsmaking and what people can and can't do within that spectrum.
I think someone says to Zola, I'm glad you're here because the journalists came and they didn't do anything. And they were so grateful that he had come to report on, I think it was pollution and farmland. Is that right?
Yeah, and I took a lot of cues, all my cues from both of them, and so wherever they went, they would not posture to be anything more professional than what they were, like just a couple of dudes riding bikes around the country and city, taking pictures when they felt like it. On the flip side, if you want to, if you're in China, you want to speak to the bureau chief of the AP or something, it helps to seem more professional. But I'm not, I'm just a filmmaker. So in reality,
I think what's interesting about this, though, so why is it that being a journalist then is a dangerous thing to authorities? Let's also talk about, maybe not necessarily to like a mob on the street, which there might be other things that are going on there. But why is why does that distinction matter? And I think the idea is, okay, so if you're a journalist, that means that tomorrow it's going to be in the paper, or tomorrow it's going to be in the news. And I think there's like some, gap of, imagination and progress where you realize it doesn't matter if you're a journalist. Because, why would it matter except to say that you expect them that it's going to be something that's broadcast or publicized? But now everybody has that ability.
But there's a certain credibility that's lended to any professional journalist. I think that authority, because if some citizen just says, well, I saw this person get murdered, you don't really know.
Can I point something out, though, that's interesting? In journalism, you have an obligation to represent, or at least there's this idea that you're representing both sides. So that when you're coming out and, for example, if they were going to report on my activities in reporting on oil and gas, a major news network would go ahead and get the quote-unquote other viewpoint, the other side. But what happens if the other side just lies all the time? They just lie constantly. So then you're not reporting. You're actually in a situation where the corporate media is allowing the major corporations to game the system, because they're not actually doing journalism. They're doing this he said, she said thing, which is to not investigate who's actually telling the truth. And you see this happening over and over. Yeah, but this is happening even in the New York Times. It is very, very frustrating. I know two different reporters from the New York Times. One of them is a journalist, and the other one is a gossip columnist. And he comes out and he interviews me, and then he interviews oil and gas, and whatever they said has equal weight in the paper without it actually being investigated. So I think that, or whether or not it's true. And the difficult trap of a lot of journalism, right, is that you can't then say, oh, well, actually we discovered that this side is lying. And the big change happens to be that you have 12 publicists per one journalist in America right now. So it's the publicists that are writing the news. It's their press releases. We have this this issue of, I'm not saying there's an answer, but there's this issue of journalism being able to, I'm not here to discredit journalism. What I'm saying is it's interesting that there is this game being played with this idea of who is the journalist and who's not right now, and that has somehow legitimized a viewpoint which is very slick, and it used to basically campaigning rather than speaking. You know what I'm saying?
Well, that gets at the importance of credibility, and wherever it comes from, whether it comes from a citizen reporter on his bicycle living in a garage to the New York Times, which I do think does a better job than you give us credit for. But anyway, I'm not going to get into that. I think he's like, I don't like the Times.
Well, I mean, I read the paper. I read it all the time, but most of the time I'm shaking my head and laughing when I'm reading it. But one thing in Egypt in Egypt right now, there's very much a media war going on. Okay, within amongst the population of the official state TV line and the official government papers and everything, and then everybody else, not including the foreign press. I'm talking about Egyptian citizen reporters, and of course, the state has a monopoly over television and a lot of the papers and a lot of what is said in even the independent papers. So what's happening now is kind of a movement called Kazibun, which means liars. And these are just citizen activists that have lots of clips and photographs and of certain events that happen in Egypt where a lot of people died and got, whether they were driven over by tanks or they were, died in a soccer stadium or they were shot at in the street. All of that footage is completely censored and illegal to show. And I think there's also some complicity from Western media to also kind of censor that material and not show that material. I think it's, it really depends on how politically convenient the story is at the moment. But what people are doing in Egypt is they're literally going out into the streets and projecting these videos onto walls of buildings, onto statues, onto, walking around with laptops and sitting down and showing people that don't have access to satellite TV or internet, and showing them the photographs of dead Egyptians or showing them videos where people are getting killed by the army or the police. And this is just a grassroots movement, and it's a total circumvention of this, institutionalized news that we're all tired of, because when we watch state TV, I watch it just to see what the lie is this week. It's like the complete opposite of the truth. So it can tell us it's very insightful to watch this stuff because it gives some kind of it gives me insight into how is the regime thinking, But of course the opposite is being done by citizens. So there's a real tug of war for perception of minds and changing minds, because so many Egyptians really just rely on the state TV media, this kind of terrestrial television, and they don't really question it. They just kind of take it as truth, even though it's complete opposite of the truth. So,
in terms of the kind of underground activists, truth seekers, revolutionaries, I'd love to hear you guys talk about what you've kind of learned from each other's situations. The Arab Spring has informed U.S. activism. Occupy Wall Street might not have happened without the Arab Spring. Some people say Ai Weiwei may have influenced events. Allison, do you think what you saw was influenced by other events?
Well, I guess I feel like it's, for me, when I heard the question, I want to take it to what the takeaway message then becomes from hearing any one individual story. And I think that the point is, when you talk about how Egyptians, relate to state media, sounds pretty similar to in China, but it also sounds like there's some discontent, and we kind of feel that way about, media here, right? And just the idea that there isn't places where things are really free and places where things are really not free. And where freedom of expression or freedom of the press is guaranteed and not under threat, and places where it's an authoritarian regime and therefore it's not. And the fact that it's all on one spectrum, and the fact that a lot of people watch the film about Ai Weiwei and they, say, that one thing, I could imagine that happening here, or we have someone here who's in jail who, for revealing information, or for all, you know, all these things, or this was censored. And the fact that it's not, if you're not taking a global perspective on all of these, I think that you're kind of missing the point.
Yeah, it seems like there's, you know, different levels of this sense of the failure of journalism, especially, you know, you can be in China or the U.S. and journalism or wherever, and journalism is supposed to be that last protective barrier between you and the government, or you and powerful corporation, and it fails us constantly, repeatedly. You know, one of the first things that my younger character Zola had said to me early on was that, like, you know, in China all news is good news, and he thinks that's crap, you know, and there's a huge distrust, obviously, in China for the mainstream media, and that's, I think, a shared sentiment here. You know, we question this sort of model now. I think everybody questions this sort of top-down hierarchical delivery of information, and we clearly live in this networked sort of world, and information is not just coming from the top down, but going in all directions. And how do you vet that is another question.
And who's controlling the networks online too? That is something that really concerns. I mean, not in quite as high profile of a way, but I also had a sort of post-production thing that I ended up getting in on us also, Huffington Post, a lot of blog coverage, when essentially Facebook closed down my account for putting up these photos that were published in The Guardian and all these places, because Ai Weiwei, some photos that he had put up, naked photos with some of his Twitter fans with some, you know, art in the pictures, and the government has been threatening that maybe they're going to bring pornography charges for these very not pornographic photos. But I had them and I put them up on Facebook as part of the conversation about Ai Weiwei, and sort of, you know, this is what everyone's talking about. You could see it on Guardian, or I put them up, and Facebook kept warning me to take them down, and I felt like, oh God, the whole issue is censorship, and I feel kind of bad about taking these down. So I covered up all the nudity with Facebook logos, and so I took down the nude photos, but I had the ones with Facebook on. And then, oh man, we got a lot of interest in both cases, you know, and you know, with people having a real productive conversation too about this. And 2 days later, without any other warnings, my personal account was shut off. Actually, the page was not shut off. And I don't know why that was, or if it's because there are several administrators to the page. I'm not the only one who controls the page. But my account was shut off, and I was pissed. And I feel like, talk about learning from, you know, our situation. I feel like I'm kind of a student of Weiwei as I've ever had to deal with the press. Or in this case, sort of like, well, what would Weiwei do? So I started tweeting about it. I was really mad. All the Chinese, you know, a lot of Shanghaiists, you know, China Digital Times, there's a lot of blogs that know me and know Weiwei, so they immediately covered it. I wrote an op-ed piece for Huffington Post. I had the Guardian reporter in China. I was emailing with her. She's like, I'm writing to the press people at Facebook. They don't usually respond, but like, give me all the information. And she, you know, wrote to them and said, why did the documentary filmmaker for Ai Weiwei get her account shut down? And it was about like 6 hours later, it suddenly got reinstated with no statement, no anything like that. But you know, and I feel like, again, talk about like, so this wasn't the government, but it's like Facebook, and what are these spaces that we are putting so much faith in that are going to be what, you know, brings about change in our society? But who's controlling those, and not to take that for granted at all either.
I want to just back up and say, I don't think we're talking about journalism failing. I think what we're talking about is something that's unsuppressible and irrepressible, you know. And when you see, you often think about this in a context of China or dictatorships in the Middle East. It's also happening here in many ways. But the interesting thing about it is that it's a fight. It's a fight. It's going to be a fight. It's not going to be. There's not some sheltering aegis like the First Amendment or Facebook. There is always that fight on your hands, and the question is, are you willing to do that, and to what length are you willing? When I watched your film last night, I broke down several times towards the end of it, going, I can't, because his one tweet, well, what could they possibly do to me? And then all of a sudden you find out, right? And when you're in that position, you have to make that kind of choice. It's like, am I going to put my
life in peril, and I don't even know what I'm imperiling right now. All I know is I'm sort of standing for this principle, but what could they possibly do to me? And then the answer, it's somebody you don't want to know the answer. But it's the point is that it is a moment where we have these amazing tools, and documentary is one of those. I mean, I think documentary is doing an amazing job of journalism. I learn more at this festival about the rest of the world than I do. Well, I don't have a television, so I wouldn't, but you know what I mean?
What about, though, this might be interesting just to chat a little bit more about how there's a little bit of a sense well, more than a little bit of a sense of a kind of global rise in activism, destabilizing repressive regimes, whether because of the internet and this kind of technology infrastructure, it's impossible to suppress dissent, like the cat and mouse game, which was in our kind of ad for the panel. Do you feel that there is a lot of interplay between, I'm especially interested in Arab Spring and China. I think that's a fascinating question. And at the end of your film, you said there was a new agency created in response to the Arab Spring to try to keep things under control.
Right, yeah, the State Information Internet Bureau, I think it's called, was formed to sort of consolidate the different agencies so that there would be more organized oversight.
There are already 40,000
Well,
internet police, but that's not enough, I guess.
Right.
And China has for a long time had a very clear policy on the internet. The idea of both, you want as little to be anonymous as possible, so you can always track where things are coming from, whose IP address it is, and who that individual is, and that also you want to be able to block. You want to both keep things out. It's about suppressing things, but just as much, it's about seeding the story that you want and having people out there who are writing on message boards and who are kind of bringing the conversation in a particular way. And they've made at their national party meetings, last year or 2 years ago, there was a speech that got leaked out where they talk about, very openly, that is the policy, that's the goal. And in some ways, it shows a great deal of foresight on the government's part, that maybe they don't really underestimate the power of the internet, and they are always trying to stay ahead of it. But the question is, really, can you? Back to the question of whether you can suppress it or not, because, even within, Weibo, which is sort of Chinese microblogging, within the firewall, people are having all kinds of conversations about a lot of things. It's not, it is too hard to keep it all down or to keep people from having a creative way to talk about something.
You saw a bit of an overreaction also in some ways right after the Arab Spring, where there were hundreds of people being rounded up. The rumors had spread that there was going to be a Chinese Jasmine revolution, and that people were congregating for that. And one of my older characters in particular, he was that was a rumor that I openly said I had nothing to do with and was not actually interested in, because when and if we have any kind of revolution, it's not gonna be called the Jasmine Revolution. It's gonna have its own particular name and style, and it's gonna look very, very different, because China's a very different place, and it's not about just the access to the people used to say is the internet going to change the future of China? Is technology and social media going to change the future course of China? Well, no, that's just a tool, and it's gonna be about how citizens and netizens, activists decide how to best use those tools.
Yeah. No, I think, at the same time, all this technology is it's very interesting, but consider that in Egypt, for example, 60% of the population is living under $2 a day. So they can't afford a $1,000 iPhone, and if they have a phone, it's probably an old clunky Nokia, maybe it has a camera. But people are very inventive, they're very inventive and creative about how they share information. And Egyptians love to talk, and they basically kind of it's word of mouth. Everything's word of mouth, and they love to argue. They love to sit in coffee shops and kind of it's kind of a different culture. I know that like my friends, some of the younger guys, they were using their BBM messenger to stay in touch with if there was a gathering, or if there was a march, or if there was certain areas that were too dangerous, or if there were checkpoints or things like this. I mean, it's a very in that sense, the cat and mouse game is being played, but by a very small group of people. The younger, kind of more affluent, say multilingual, educated kids, and they're a very small group, actually. But they're very highly mobile and highly communicating, and of course each one is then communicating to his immediate friends or followers or just people that are next to him at the cafe. They tell people, it's talking. So the tech is not that, it's really not doing that much in the case of Egypt because of the poverty and the illiteracy and all of those things. But what really helped in terms of what the revolution is representing is people that are just simply fed up. And you can't replace feet on the ground and bodies in the street with kind of tweeting through the revolution, I mean, you can't be at home making revolution through your messages unless you really go down there and unless you're there and in harm's way. And that's really what people did, and they continue to do. So I don't really know. Maybe in the States it'd be a bit different situation, or China is much more tech, but it's also has a lot of poverty as well. So I don't know. I think it would take a lot of time to kind of get to that critical mass of technology being so familiar for us to use and to our advantage.
Can I ask a question? Are you worried that the film will make it worse for Ai Weiwei, or in all these situations, do you feel like that there's a certain amount of daylight that actually makes the situation better because there's a reaction? What are your thoughts about it? Because I feel like it works. It can work both ways.
I think in Ai Weiwei's case, it's a really unique situation because, I mean, as much as I do think that the film is going to bring his story to so many more people, and it matters a lot that it's made by someone else. It's not just him putting out his own story, but it is like the take of me as the filmmaker. He still, I think, makes his fate. I really don't feel like I make his fate. If you Google his name, a lot of other things come up before my movie. He's in the news all the time, not articles, and they don't even mention my movie. That said, of course, though, that it was a concern that, I didn't know the answer to at one point. And during his detention, it was sort of one case where we didn't know, is he going to get out? Is this going to be 5 years or 10 years? Which sort of, if that was the case, it felt like any talking about him, that should help, right? Then once he's released, for me, I had like 2 points of view. One was like, okay, now wait, stop. He needs to see the film and tell me what he thinks this is going to mean for him. But also, now that we have the hindsight of, he got released after 81 days, and we saw how big of an international outcry there was, that international pressure must have played a role in some way, which I felt like while it was happening, there was a part of me that was like, China doesn't like to be told what to do. I mean, no country likes to be told by another country what to do, right? So I was sort of like, I don't know if this is going to matter, or is this going to antagonize, the authorities more? But I do feel like once he was out, it felt like you could kind of say that had to have played a role. But, for now, I really think for him, he's really still very committed to talking about these values and bringing these messages out, and so the movie is like doing that work. So he's definitely, in support of it.
And I don't think, to add to that, any ethically minded person could ever go to China and not think very, very profoundly about these exact questions. And I think in both of our cases, we're dealing with people who talk about this idea of risk in this way, that you're willing to take risks, and calculated risks at that, if you're interested in changing the status quo. And
And the risk to your subjects because of your film, do you have a sense of that yet?
Well, that's something I was really very sort of preoccupied with, and from the very beginning made sure that they were comfortable with, and that they didn't feel like I would be adding any additional risk to them. And
especially when your subject is so active on social media, there's nothing in my film that's not already in the public sphere.
Right.
But most people don't obsessively read everything about Ai Weiwei. Like, there's still the value of bringing it all together as a story. But the reality is there's very little that I'm not even sure if there's anything there that's like never been out in the world. It's just like most people haven't seen all his films and followed all of his Twitter and gone and talked to him about his family. It's like, in the end, it's not.
He's one of the most famous people in China, right? But your guys are pretty small potato, right?
In some ways, but
they're like the next tier. They're pretty famous online, I would say.
Like over the course of about 4 years of filming them, I saw them do countless interviews, from NHK to BBC to Reuters, Wall Street Journal, filmed a lot of press interviews of them working with international
you only show one
media.
French photo shoot.
Yeah, they're just boring to watch. So you want to watch like the verite material.
5 minutes. Oh my God, we only have 5 minutes. Yes. Wait, 10 minutes. 15? 10. Great. Question time. I think we have a mic somewhere for audience. Well, maybe for the recording they want a mic. Does it matter?
I can belt it out.
Okay, so you were first.
Yeah, I have a comment and two questions. Quickly, I just want to say thank you to all of you for all you've done and what you've brought. And then, tagging on to the last comments of Karim, just wondering how you personally are affected. Part of you is kind of worried about you being in that environment when we're talking about the subjects. Then my question is, and to you, or any of you, is sort of an honest answer about for a young person going into journalism. Do you think that that's a good background to go out and tell the truth and work from the perspective?
Well, I guess it's a bit unique for me because like my film is in a sense, it's really about, my family and my group of friends. We're the characters in the film. So, and we're showing where we live, we're showing what's going on in our house. So it's a very personal story. And of course we're worried, I'm a little bit worried about when the film is shown in Egypt, what the ramifications will be. I'm not sure yet. We're kind of leaking it out a little bit so that there's some kind of padding, but April 2nd, the French Cultural Center will show the film. And of course, I think that it may even be banned. We'll see. It may not even be screened. It's funny because we're making this film and we're showing it all around the world. We can't show it in the country that we made it in. And I think there'll be some kind of repercussions. I just don't know what they will be. But at the same time, we're all in the revolution together, and we're all kind of. There have been so many more incredible tales of personal sacrifice in terms of the revolution, people being shot, being blinded, losing both of their eyes, and going back for more. So in a sense, I think the danger to me is something that's much less than what I've already seen people do. So.
Another question, yep.
I was wondering, Stephen, since we're talking about Firewalls, if Zola went to Taiwan for political or personal purposes, or a combination, and if he's been more effective at circumventing the firewall now that he's in Taiwan.
Well, there's not any of the same censorship restrictions in Taiwan, so he's very psyched to be in Taiwan right now. As to whether he's effective or not, I would say less, but for more personal reasons. He's just sort of like been laying low in an attempt to make his sort of transition period go smoother. So that's to be seen what happens after this stage once the residency sort of paperwork goes through and that's all squared away.
He was tweeting with Weiwei last night. Everyone's talking about Lei Feng Day tomorrow. Anyway,
right.
yeah, I was following that. But I wanted to say something about your second question, if that's okay, about for a young person who's going into all this, and despite maybe some of the tenor, which I also think is true, what we were saying before. I mean, I do find value in the part of me that also I consider myself a journalist, and I think because I think of it in the best way. I mean, if you come in, I think everybody sitting here is. Did filmmaking that also adhered to, again, it's about the principles less than the label, but the fact that you do really care about, the accuracy of what you're doing. It's not in name that you show another side because you have to, but if you're really in pursuit of the truth and getting your facts right, I mean, that to me is just the most important and part and parcel with documentary filmmaking, which I think is nice because it frees you from the constraints of journalism, which are sometimes very practical, like time limits and space and all those kind of things. And the fact that, as a creative person, you can make it however you decide you want to make it and then see if people, if that works for people. But yeah, so I mean, I think that seeing yourself also as a journalist for all the things that good journalism stands for is so important for documentary for me.
This is Joshua. You were talking about about how in mainstream media we feel this responsibility to present multiple sides of the story, and they're not necessarily weighted appropriately. And I kind of wanted to get your opinion on the subject that exists in documentaries and maybe like how that's different than the underlying subject.
Well, I don't think there's anything wrong. The question was about perhaps unequal weight in the mainstream media versus the subjectivity of a documentary. I think the issue is about media always being pointed in some way or the other, and that there's this sort of illusion that we have this mainstream media that is somehow the truth or the balanced viewpoint, right? Because I don't think that that's true at all. I think that I mean, I work for the mainstream media. I work for HBO. So there's this idea, though, that somehow these other sources, CNN, or you probably know that you have the Fox News on the right, and you have the MSNBC on the left, and you're always reading different opinions. I think it's up to people to decipher that. But what's so interesting is that often that we think of subjectivity as something only in a documentary, but it's really not. It's really in the fact that even if I go on MSNBC and I have Rachel Maddow or I have Ed Schultz being like, "You're reporting on this is terrific," and then I'm followed by a natural gas commercial like 7 times. Seriously, and then you somehow are in the middle of a totally other kind of conversation.
But I would emphasize that there's no inherent contradiction between opinion and journalism. I work for the opinion section of the Times, and our whole premise is this is work with a viewpoint. It can be a very strong argued viewpoint, but it is all based in fact. And there's a real difference there between someone who's claiming to be a straight reporter who is violating basic journalistic ethics, and someone who says, "I am opinionated, but I can back this up." So, yes.
I want to ask you a question, Jason, because you've been gracious to do this for us. And when let you start it in, I really want you to give a plug for what you're doing and explain it. It's new. If you're new to the New York Times, it's a new area, because it does blend the documentary world, even though they put it over on the opinion side. But I find it very interesting and recognition of this need of another way of telling a story.
Yeah. Well, okay. A very brief kind of plug for this. The op-ed page, which has been around for around 41, 42 years, decided to have video as now a very important part of the, of the journalism, but saying, what should this be, basically? What type of video should we be doing? And my background is in documentary filmmaking and journalism, but I have kind of been growing this initiative to have documentary filmmakers bring their voices into this and saying documentary filmmaking is a very important type of storytelling. I think we all agree that. and it can have a position, and this can also have news value. So we have this series called Op Docs. Allison did a piece. We run them a few times a month, and they're short form documentaries.
I think it's important to always keep in mind that, like, when you're making or watching a documentary about a very sort of critical issue, that you remember, like, you know, we are sitting here whittling down 600, 1,000 hours of reality-based material into 1 hour. And so it's this hugely subjective representational art. We only are guided by like some sort of like moral compass within ourselves, and we vet it as best as we can, but it's not the truth. I mean, this is our version of it. It's what we saw, and it should be taken as that, I think.
We have 1 more minute. Okay, so 1 more question.
I just want to know what do you think about the freedom in the internet in the future? So we all know that there is a firewall in China, and also we have SOPA and PIPER here, and then ACTA in Europe, and Canada has their own thing, like C12 or something. So, and also a few days ago, Russia and China tried to pass a bill in UN that regular internet in the whole world, I think. So what do you think about the future of freedom in online?
Be vigilant. Be very, very vigilant. I think you're totally right to point out that it crosses, you know, that every country is either, you know, is behind in figuring out how they want to deal with it, that the internet space is you know, regulation of the internet space and who controls the internet space is something that I think we all take for granted. I don't know the answer about what's going to happen, so yeah, I'm not going to try to say what the answer is, but be vigilant was my reaction.
You know, there's an expert named Rebecca McKinnon who's done a tremendous amount of research on this, and she's looked very heavily into sort of this idea of like the corporate code of conduct that should be sort of recognized by corporations that are trying to get a piece of the market share in, you know, spaces like China or Egypt or Iran or wherever, and you know, that market concerns are sort of preceding human rights concerns, and that's a very serious issue.
And that we need to fight for transparency on all these things. So even if we can't, like, at least the first step is knowing about what is being passed or who is controlling what. You know, in this last summer, talked about places taking a page out of the book of what we might think of as China and the firewall or something like that. During the London riots, then they were talking about shutting down the internet. Who's shutting it down because who is expressing themselves? And this at the exact same time, in Oakland, they were going to turn off the internet within the BART stations specifically because it was around the time of a court case that involved a police shooting, that they were afraid of rioting, and so their decision was, so how about we turn off cell service and internet service within all the BART stations? I mean,
Well, yeah, I guess we all need to be vigilant. Maybe that's a good way to end.
But I think, can I just say one thing? And I think that you have to remember that there's way more of us than there are of them. And we all have cameras, and we all have a keyboard, and we have a brain, and a lot of us in the West, we have an education. And I think that, you know, it's always going to be this tug of war, you know, between what the people want and what these governments and corporations want us to do with that technology. And I don't think it's ever going to be just completely defined into and, you know, compartmentalized where they do this and we do that, and no one can you know, initiate some kind of new way of doing things. I mean, you know, filming policemen abusing somebody is sort of a right that we, and sort of an obligation that we have to do to kind of maintain, you know, our laws, the people's laws, not some kind of regime's laws for them to hide behind. So that's always going to be going, you know, cat and mouse back and forth. But I think the thing is just keep shooting if something, and keep writing. And if something is upsetting you, or, you know, something that you want to fight for, just do it. Do it. Don't wait for someone else to do it, because, you know, we all have to kind of police them and not allow ourselves to be only policed by them. You know, we're defining the laws. It's not the other way around. At least in this country, you know, in Egypt it took a revolution to kind of start to clean out all of these shackles that we've been living under for 30 years. And I think America has the opportunity to develop this relationship without resorting to violent kind of revolution.
Right, and hopefully we'll get through the spring, the American spring.
One quick question. If you didn't have lenses, how would you tell your story? If you didn't have the medium.
I mean, do you very specifically mean we couldn't take pictures or video?
Yeah.
Well, I did a lot of radio journalism. I don't know if that's like a nice thing, but I love radio journalism as well because I think that things can be made faster and you can get more access to things. It's more of a production when you're doing video, but there's a really big payoff. So I love radio journalism. That would be my choice.
I think we need to wrap. Yeah. Okay. Thank you guys, and thank you to.